And so you'll hear from a number of folks around different challenges. But for Wes, for those of you who don't know him, he is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, one of the largest anti-poverty fighting organizations in this country. Um, Again, last year, giving out over $100 million in its 30 years, having given out over, if I remember the figure correctly, about 2.2 billion. Again, towards fighting poverty using data as well as compassion to help do that work. They are also, and we're happy to have him here, a big supporter of CUNY in a number of ways. And again, Wes, I think we'll have some more to say about that kind of continuing support going forward. For those of you who don't know him, and again, I've been lucky to call him a friend for a long time. He is an author. He is a combat veteran. He is a former Rhodes Scholar and White House Fellow. And he is someone who has thought very deeply about how you have an economy that is just and that is prosperous. And I think when we, and again, when we think about that here, I think that's what we're trying to do here. How do we create an economy that is prosperous and it's just, that makes us prosperous and that makes us proud? And so with that, I won't take up too much time. We're going to have basically a first kind of fireside chat here between he and I. And then we're going to really go into questions. So as you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll make sure to ask it. One thing I don't think I've told Wes, maybe I have before, is that Wes, for our single moms work, we actually brought your mom in to be our keynote speaker for that. And so initially when I said your name to be one of our keynotes for this, my colleague said, well, wait, can we get Wes's mom? Is she not available? And I said I would pass that on to you, but one thing else to know about Wes is that it runs in the family. His mom was an unbelievable asset to the work that we've done with single mothers, and I'm sure her baby boy will do her proud here. So with that, let's begin this conversation with Wes Moore. And for Wes, here's what I want to ask you to start with. You all have supported higher education and CUNY in New York City for a long time, because you see them as a lever to deal with poverty and now economic mobility. I would love to hear you begin to talk about what is a specific role you see for higher education, particularly community colleges, in moving economic mobility and eradicating poverty?
So first, again, man, thank you. Thank you for not just for your long-term friendship, but for your example. And honestly, for inviting me here. It is beyond a pleasure to be with all of you at the Education Design Lab. I am so sorry that you got the short straw by getting me instead of my mom, because she really is. I mean, she is not just a powerhouse, but she is. It's amazing when you can call your greatest role model your parent. But that's exactly what she is. So I'm very, very humble to have to follow anything that she does. But I'm very excited to be with y'all today. And I'm really glad you started with that question, because the interesting thing about it, Chike, is we are a very data-driven organization, and I think that's been part of the history of Robin Hood, and I think that's part of the identity of the organization, is that every single thing we do, we will find ways to measure, and part of it's because it's like I think about the idea of the things that we support. We don't believe in supporting based on annual reports or which pictures organizations use, but it really is about what is the data? What does the data continue to show us about why this is important? And the data actually on this issue is pretty clear. Part of the reason that I think we're so involved and engaged in community college work and the work of places like CUNY, amongst others, is that if your goal and your focus is sustainable economic mobility, there's not one thing that has a more sustainable lever and has a more sustainable baseline to create measurable economic mobility than not just access to higher education, but frankly, the role that community colleges play. And, and it's interesting because you'll have conversations with people where they'll talk about things like, well, we need to put more money into infrastructure spending and so on and so forth. And my answer is, I agree. I think all of these things have been terribly and horribly underfunded. I also, though, know this, is that we could pass an infrastructure bill tomorrow, but at some point, those bridges will be rebuilt, and those roads will be repaved, and those buildings will be erected. And then what? Because the thing that we know, and the thing that continues to show, is that if you actually want to address poverty, if you actually want to address economic mobility, it's not just about increasing investment, but it really is about measures of doubling down on the ways that we think about ways we're going to help people be able to achieve not just academic credentialing, but also the psychological change that comes with academic credentialing. And I say this not only as the CEO of Robinhood, frankly, I say this as a community college grad. I say this as someone who has an associate's degree. And I can tell you right now that my associate's degree and the coursework that I did there, it didn't just change my academic credentialing or my LinkedIn profile. We didn't have LinkedIn back then, but you know what I mean? But it actually changed my psychology. It changed the financial opportunities that I had about which schools I would actually finish up later on in. And it also goes back to this idea sometimes when people say, well, this is, community colleges or placements like this are great job training programs. I think we can't forget the fact that when we're talking about the average graduate of our two-year college systems, an average graduate that comes from people that are graduating from junior college or two-year schools, we're talking about not things that are small enhancements, right? We're talking about the average graduate with associate's degree earn $10,000 per year on average, more than someone who does not have that. We're talking about the reality that, even though we still have educational systems that are wrought with systemic inequities, and we can get into that in a second, that we're talking about one of the few economic engines that exist. And so whether it's our work with CUNY, whether it's our work with BCC Future Now, whether it's our work with our Micro Pathways initiative, all these are things that really represent crown jewels in Robinhood's portfolio. And it's not just because we think it's important, but it's because the data continues to show us that it works.
So I'm going to ask a question I didn't mean to ask you, but you said it, and I think it's really important. And I want you to actually go back to your time in industry, go back to your time in finance. And you said something, which is the value of that degree is not simply the technical training that you got, but there were what we would probably call 21st century skills. Yeah. And talk about that, because this is a big staple for us. We're making a big bet here that this is critical to getting people either into work for the first time or back into work if they've fallen out due to COVID or anything else. Talk about, from your experience and even from the work that you've done here at Robinhood, how important those are to getting people on that economic mobility ladder.
Yeah, and I think one of the really nice things about it, particularly when we're looking at whether it be community college systems, is oftentimes these are systems that are closest to the ground and also have the greatest connection to how can we be that connective tissue between the work industry and the people we're looking to serve, right? When you look at the places where really creative mechanisms have been put into place, where you can have the private sector and you can have large employers who are then working with institutions of higher education to not just focus on measures of credentialing, but also what are people actually being trained on, and then how do we pipeline them? It shouldn't be any surprise to people that oftentimes the first conversations are happening with community college systems. And so when we're talking about what it means for students to be able to move and matriculate into community college systems, we know that oftentimes it's not even just that it becomes a more affordable option for many students to be able to navigate that process. It's oftentimes that it's the option that they're most connected to, because the community college systems are oftentimes the ones who are closest to the ground and closest to the communities and closest to the schools. So there becomes a much more natural transition when it comes to being able to make that, to be able to make that jump for the students, both into higher education and then also beyond higher education. And so as we have these elements, and I think about it, to your point, Chica, about my own experiences, where part of the beauty for me of being able to start off within the community college system, start off in a two-year system, was it allowed me the chance to not only gain measures of the academic supports that I knew that I would need for long-time transitions. It also gave me a chance to understand what it was that I was trying to get done for my higher education experience. What was it that I was actually trying to get out of this thing called higher education? And how then did I see very practical ways of taking that and then applying that into the things that I wanted to do later on in life? So frankly, by the time I went on to my four-year institution, the transition actually wasn't as complicated as I know it could have been or would have been, because in many ways my psychology had changed long before I walked onto that campus. And so I think that's really the place that higher education actually has a bit of a secret sauce, and community colleges has a bit of a secret sauce, because it is a place where you can kind of combine potential and aspirations with practical operations in a way that many other schools just don't have that same level of connective tissue. And then you honestly have a lot of students who find themselves struggling to identify it, find it, and build it. And then the wrong takeaways are then taken from them as they enter into these other higher education frameworks.
So I want to touch a little bit on, and I'm going to thread this a little bit. You all, I know, and this has been a mark of your tenure, Wes, at Robinhood, still talking about poverty, of course, that is the mission of Robinhood, but the rise of this economic mobility narrative that you have really pushed, that getting someone, if I have my figures correctly, $24,000 for a family of four, getting them to $26,000 is not victory. Right. We need to, and I've heard you use this before, an escape velocity from poverty. That I need to get you far enough away so that you don't roll back in. So I want you to talk about how you all have thought about economic mobility, because for us, as we think about this, our goal is not just to get anyone any job. Our goal is to get them in a job that, frankly, can provide economic dignity, that is in a field that's growing, that from whence you can build a career. So talk about how you've defined economic mobility, and in many ways, maybe how some of your giving has changed or grown or evolved as you've thought about that, because I think each of these institutions has to think about this as we think about what we're training people for.
Yeah, and it's funny, I'm glad you asked that, because at times when I talk about the shift that we've made from this idea of going from from poverty alleviation to sustainable economic mobility, there were people who would then challenge, say, well, that's semantics. No, it's not. It's not at all. They're two different things. In fact, not only are there two different things, I actually don't even know what poverty alleviation means. I mean, poverty alleviation to me sounds like it's like, how are we making poverty more tolerable? How are we easing the pain of those who happen to be facing the impacts and the brutal constraints of poverty? That shouldn't be any of our business. That shouldn't be any of our business model. That shouldn't be any of our goals. I'm not interested in poverty alleviation. I'm interested in poverty elimination. I'm interested in the idea of making it so that people don't have to feel this generational and oftentimes predictable impact of poverty. And to your point, Chike, when people say, we can lift up a family. If you're looking at it, if you're looking at this idea that the federal poverty rate, which by the way hasn't moved, but the federal poverty rate is a little over $24,000 for a family of four. If a family's making $26,000, they're not good. And especially when you consider the fact that the federal poverty rate does not include the basic things like housing and food. And when you're looking at jurisdictions like New York, what do you think are the main drivers of poverty? Housing and food. And so if we're not being honest about what that means and what should be the target, then there's no way that we can be honest about what are the different measures and the mechanisms that we have to be in place to actually to be able to combat it. And so I think part of it does come down to how do we think about the infrastructure plays that are supporting people and making sure that we have policies in place that are giving people better platforms and opportunities. It's one of the reasons why we built out a policy wing in the organization. It's one of the reasons that that we will consistently and pretty full-throatedly identify policy items that we think are going to make a market difference in our society. Things like why we need to make adjustments to child tax credits, why we need to make adjustments to universal, and why we need to advocate for housing being a human right, how we need to advocate for things like, how are we making adjustments to child care policies as you're having the same conversations about recovery policies. But it is also about understanding the fact that the only thing that we have proven to really create measures of sustainable economic mobility in our society is actually the pathway into higher education. Nothing else has had a sustainable impact. Nothing else has been able to actually move with a level of consistency and certainty of family going from one economic condition to another economic condition. And the thing I think we also have to then, contend with is the fact that when we disaggregate the data actually does get complicated, right? We do have to factor in for the differences in everything from race and gender and all these other things that we can get into later on if you'd like. But being able to know and being able to have data around the fact that higher education is not just a pathway into employment, but it's a pathway in how do we create employers. It's not just the pathway in terms of how do you get credentials, but it's the pathway in how do you unlock that ingredient into high-paying, fast-growing employment opportunities that students can then have a level and a measure of flexibility. Because this is the thing too, when people say, well, this is about getting people jobs. The problem is that our job market is moving so fast. And the jobs that are big and significant now, there is no guarantee as to where that job will be 3 to 5 to 7 years from now. And so higher education does become important because not only does it change the psychology, it changes the flexibility mechanisms for a student to be able to navigate from one occupation to a different occupation, one profession to a different profession, with a greater measure of flexibility and a greater measure of ease. Because that, frankly, is what this economy is going to require. And we have to be able to give students the better platforms to be able to do just that.
No, thank you for that, Wes. And again, I'll say for all of our colleagues who are on the phone, who are on the Zoom rather, please put in questions or thoughts into the chat function, and I'll kind of filter those through for our second half hour. Wes, I want you to think about, you all have been around since what is it, 88?
88.
88. And so you have over 3 decades of experience. You all have, I know, invested in a number of workforce initiatives over the last 30 years. Think about whether it be the last 4 years where you've been in the lead or even before that. What have you seen be the common indicators of success for folks who've actually been able to move folks into economic mobility and on that path? What have you seen as the common threads and patterns that potentially some of our folks can learn and apply? Because we have folks who are on the right side of the curve. We have folks who have been doing this work in the communities for a long time. But I think what we have seen, and if we're blunt with ourselves, no one has solved this at scale in any jurisdiction in this country, even for the amazing folks we have here on the phone. So as we think about this, I think all the what I love here about folks who are on the phone or on the Zoom rather is that they also bring a very much of a beginner's humility and a beginner's mindset to this work, not because they're beginners, but because they understand there's still more to learn. So I'd love to hear from you what lessons you've learned from making these investments. And potentially things that you kind of surface for this group.
It's tough to even know where to begin about lessons learned, because I feel like every single week and every single day we're getting new stuff. And actually, I think that's part of the answer. Is it's an ability to be fluid and flexible with what we're seeing. I feel like so many of the initiatives that we are funding now, we could not have even imagined 10 years ago, because we learned, and there were new organizations that were filling out certain needs that we didn't even realize were as significant a need as they were before. So I think there's an expression in the military where people say, stay frosty. I feel like part of the job of philanthropy in this moment is to kind of stay frosty, because you're continually getting new things that are teaching you. I think about whether it's our, the CUNY Micropathways initiative, where, there's an initiative where it's looking at 6 community colleges to participate in community college, growth engine fund to design and implement non-degree micropathways and stackable credentials in high growth middle skill jobs for close to 4,000 low income New Yorkers. This is an initiative that was really built out and brought to our attention. Because again, it's the people who are actually closest to the work and are closest to the challenge have actually identified these are things that we think are ready and built for a measure of scale, so that investments can actually help it to get to exactly that. I think about the work of CUNY ACE, right, which is in the ACE program. It's really designed to attack the problem of low degree attainment amongst students at CUNY. And one of the interesting things about it is that it really examines why students weren't finishing. Because I think there is a narrative about why students aren't finishing, and understanding that, well, they'll say it's X or Y or Z, and oftentimes it's not X or Y or Z or A or B or C, it's the alphabet, right? It is the fact that we have higher and rising costs of higher education that have to be understood and sustained, but also it is about the fact that we still have hundreds of thousands of students that aren't probably filling out the FAFSA correctly, because we have yet to make adjustments on making it an easier process for people to be able to get the financial aid that their situation merits. It is about the fact that we do need to think about the fact that we have students who are entering into higher education and still will need levels of developmental or remedial supports as they enter into higher education, despite having high school degrees. Why that becomes so challenging is because oftentimes for students who are taking developmental coursework, that coursework costs the same. It's just not worth credits. And so you can have students who will then go through a whole process of completing their freshman years and will do a full coursework, pay a full course load, and will have 6 or 3 or no credits to their name because that coursework wasn't worth the cost of the credit because it was non-credentialed academic work. That student, chances are, won't finish if for no other reason their financial aid will run out, because we have a financial aid system that oftentimes is not based on the current realities of students. We also have to factor in the fact that life gets in the way. And so, when people say, well, what is it that's keeping a student from being able to finish? We have to remember that the average college freshman that we're talking about, we're not talking about the 17 or 18-year-old who gets dropped off and picks out which bunk they have and, puts their potted plant in the corner. That the average age of the college freshman is 24 years old. Understanding the fact that, that we have to consider and think about things like childcare and transportation costs and little things that people just kind of take for granted when they think about college students. Because for college students, that's not their scenarios. And so I feel like part of the investments that we've been able to make have actually been things that have been, and part of the things I'm very proud of them, is part of the things that have to be responsive. They have to be responsive to the actual realities that students are facing on the ground right now. And frankly, we do not have systems and structures that really put that in place. Now, I'll say one more quick thing, and then I'll stop filibustering.
No, please.
I actually think we actually find ourselves in a unique opportunity right now. And here's why. It's in many ways education. We actually have a greater opportunity now to rethink and reinvent this, how we think about education, not just higher ed, but K-12, in a way that we actually have never had before. Partially it's because of the constitutional system. That education in many ways is a federalist structure, right? So we have a Department of Education, and we can have a lot of frustrations about Department of Education and what hasn't been happening within the Department of Education. But the reality is that the main core focus of the Department of Education, frankly, it's the purse, right? It's the capital. But we have a unique opportunity for states to be amazingly creative if we so choose right now, because the actual constitutional authority falls within the states. It's a federalist system. Now, we still need to get more federal support. It is unbelievable that we have gone through an entire summer without any real focus on providing support for students, despite the fact that we knew in the spring what type of challenges students were going to face, again, both on K-12 and higher education, community colleges in particular, and there has not been a deliberate focus to be able to financially support them, right? However, we actually do have a really creative and interesting opportunity right now for states, individual legislatures, governors, to be able to be really creative about this. And that's one of the things that actually gives me a great deal of hope and excitement, is the fact that we're seeing it in some circumstances, but also for the fact that we all can urge it in all circumstances. And that actually, and that gives me life, that we can actually get some creative stuff done here.
I mean, and so we'll have one kind of more question. And so one of the things that, and and we're so happy to have Robinhood be supporting CUNY as as part of the Community College Growth Engine Fund, and to sort of build these micro pathways, and and as you could probably see if you gallery view, we have like a phalanx from CUNY, like 40 people who are on this call, because New York does nothing small.
Never.
Yeah. One thing I would end with, and this comes from, again, something from Robinhood, which is your penchant for partnership, in the sense of not just your purse, which is obviously powerful, but also bringing people together who normally don't work together to get this right across these 6 very diverse, very powerful and pioneering institutions. It's not just going to be them. It's going to be their employers. It's going to be the K-12 school district. It's going to be the chamber. It's going to be the union. It's going to be folks whose names I don't know, but who are powerful and important within those communities. Let's step out of the work of the micro pathways and the economic mobility piece. But what have you learned about partnership? That, again, as we have these schools who are in this work right now, I'm going to accelerate this work going forward. What would you tell them about bringing together and keeping together diverse actors as we're trying to move towards a goal? And again, from your time in industry, from your time in the military, from your time at Robinhood, what would you impart to this group before we head into questions?
Yeah, to be, if I'm being, honest amongst friends and family, we haven't always been the best partner. And I think this has been a real learning experience for this organization, where I think that there's this idea oftentimes when we think leadership is about the masthead and who is on the masthead, in what order we're on the masthead, and who gets recognized first, without realizing who we fail every single time that we have that mindset in the way we're approaching this work. I think about partnership is not, and I don't. The reason that we have now as one of our really guiding tent posts is this idea of partnership is not just because it sounds good. It's because it's honest. It's because we don't have the power, nor size, nor strength to be able to do this work on our own. We just don't. I think about it in context where, you think about, I could walk into the office tomorrow. I'm over Zoom in the office tomorrow. And I could say, listen, we're gonna put $25 million into an education initiative, and people would cheer and, maybe even get an article written about it. But it's not lost to me that if you just take New York City alone, the Department of the K-12 system in New York City alone is $27 billion. I think we have to move in humility. I think we have to move in honesty. I think we have to stay focused on what it is that we're trying to accomplish in terms of our long-term goal. And what are the assets that we think we bring to bear, but where are the places that we think we fall short? And who are the partners that the things that we fall short on, we know that's a really good strong point for them. And how do we consistently push on this idea of accretive relationships? And I think it's the way that we're actually going to accomplish this work we're actually setting out to accomplish. And whether that be thinking about education as a holistic experience, whether it be that transition from, this K-12 to a higher educational experience, whether it's the way we think about that transition from higher ed into employment. I think part of the beauty of the place that we all kind of sit in is we all have the ability to kind of blend and erase the lines in between these worlds in a really interesting and creative way. And I think it's important to do, not just because it's different, but it's important to do because that's how people actually live. And it becomes our responsibility to be able to really be at the tip of the spear, to be able to establish and create those mechanisms.
So we have questions coming in over the chat, but I've been cold calling all day for my teacher days. And so I'm going to do it now within the Education Design Lab family. And Kathleen, our founder, who is here. Kathleen, I want to give you the privilege of the first question here to Wes as we get some more questions in.
Wow. Well, I was just actually, thank you, Wes, so much for joining us. We, even before we asked his mom to help us kick off the single moms convening in Indianapolis last year, we did ask Wes if he could join our board. This was, I think, right before you were already on the board for Robinhood, but you. And it was funny, you said, well, my wife, it had to do with the fact that you were on too many boards, and you were very interested in our mission, and we know that your interest in these issues and in us is longstanding. But your wife said, you said she would kill you if you joined another board. I was actually in chat just responding to Ken Adams from LaGuardia Community College to his comment, which, and we don't want to put you on the spot, Wes, but his comment, I was just actually typing a policy email back to him. So let me put that to you.
Right.
He asks the question, practically speaking, there's no federal state financial aid for students who aren't pursuing degree programs. And a lot of the micro pathways, the way to get to them quickly is to design them on the non-credit side. The question is, how do students pay for them? And so, he throws the question to you, will Robinhood help subsidize micro-credential training for our students? And while that's a possibility that we raise foundation dollars for some of the work, that obviously doesn't solve for the scale that we're talking about. And so,
but it is an important. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. That I was just going to open the question about how do we scale these things?
Yeah, no, because I think that's a really important question. You said Kenneth.
Yes.
Thanks, Kenneth. And first, sincerely, Kathleen, thank you for your leadership. Truly. And Kenneth, I really appreciate the question because I feel like that's part of the job of Robinhood and organizations like us, is the fact that we can be the risk capital. We can be the ones who can go in and essentially de-risk, platforms and investments that can show that this thing actually can scale out. One thing I actually believe in deeply is, I tell people the best investments that I make are investments I don't have to make for long. Right? There's a very clear strategy as to why we're making that investment. I actually think that there is a lane for certain elements of philanthropy to be long-term investments. I don't think that needs to be the lane for all philanthropy. I think certain philanthropy should be relative risk investment and should have a relative risk balance on their portfolio where we can invest in things, test them out with the exclusive goal of saying, now this is ready to pass on. Because so many of these things, government officials and laws that are being debated and examined, it's certain things are gonna be too risky for them. And I get it. I mean, I think about, Robinhood always, speaks about one of the first investments, one of the earlier investments that Robinhood made was the investments in, was the investments in needle exchange programs. And the reason that Robinhood invested in needle exchange programs was because the data continued to show that if you're looking at the rise of HIV/AIDS, that much of that at that time was due to the exchanging of dirty needles. And so the data continued to show us that if you could actually have people who were using clean needles, that it might actually have an impact on the transmission rate of HIV/AIDS. And this was a really controversial thing at the time, where people say, what do you mean you're going to give drug users needles? Like, that's not how you battle this. That's not how you fix this. But the data kept showing it actually might work. So we funded it. And now Robinhood doesn't fund needle exchange programs anymore. Nobody does. The reason is because the federal government does it. Mm-hmm. But they were never going to be first money in. Mm-hmm. And frankly, nor should they have been first money in. That's our job. That's our role. And so I'm Kenneth, I'm in complete agreement with you that when I think about things like how can we participate in and design in platforms where take the implementation of non-degree micro pathways and stackable credentials, right? To be able to create mechanisms to where this is not just about how are we impacting thousands of people, it's about how do you impact millions when you can get laws changed. Mm-hmm. But the way we change laws is both by advocacy and proof points, right? Advocacy and proof points. And I do think that there is a unique place that not just Robinhood, but just frankly the entire community, philanthropic community, actually have a place to play in both of those two things.
Well, Wes, I'm going to a question from Yvette, a fellow Prince Georgian, the other end,
Prince George's.
Yeah, the other end of 95. But generally, when we talk about workforce development, we talk about training people to go work for other people. That's generally what we talk about. What Yvette asks is, how are we building folks to not just be employees, but be employers? How do we make that entrepreneurial instinct that we know, particularly in communities of color, is so deep? How do we make sure that we are also fostering that, creating pathways for that? And again, I think about our colleagues at Seattle colleges, who that's one of the things that they're going to be focusing on. How do we, give me your thoughts there about, again, whether it be from investments that you all have already made, or how you think about the future. How do we make sure that people we're training, that we're helping people become employers, not just employees?
That you were singing my song. The fact that we still do in many ways have an educational system that is really training people how to be employees and not employers is incredibly problematic, because just if we're being completely honest, we're also very targeted about who we're teaching to be employees versus who to be employers, right? We have never had a problem, teaching people who never have known nor experienced some of the deepest pains of our nation's history how to be employers. Um, we have had a problem when it comes to looking at people where poverty and inequality and inequity, and looking at poverty, inequality, and inequity on every single level, whether you're looking at race or gender, or the levels of xenophobia or homophobia, or all these different bases that we have within our society. We have had problems doing that. And the truth is, if you look at our economic systems and economic structures in this country, they reward entrepreneurship. They reward risk taking, from everything from platforms and bases to the tax laws. And we don't have to look much further than the current conditions and some of our current leaders to see just how much we we encourage entrepreneurship and failure among certain people who have businesses. So we do have to be much more clear and assertive when it comes to how are we training people and teaching people how not just to be employees but how to be employers. Now, it's not just about how are we training them, right? It's not just about how are we including entrepreneurship curriculum. It's not just about how are we training people about balance sheets, and how are we training people about risk capital, and how are we training people about the difference between venture capital and private equity, that type of thing. It's also about the infrastructures that we have in place that allow them to do it. It is about the fact that we still in this country have a healthcare system that's very much employer based. And I mean, so when we look at what happened and what's happened over these past 8 months, part of the challenge of what's happened over the past 8 months is not that we have had an employment crisis. We've now also had a health insurance crisis, where we have millions of people who had insurance who now no longer do, right? Because we had employment and we had healthcare systems that oftentimes were tailored on employment, right? These are the type of things that keep people from being able to go out and take risks. These are the things that can keep a person from being able to say, do I necessarily want to take a punt when I know that this could have consequences on myself or on my family? We also know that we have challenges when it comes to funding and financing. When you're looking at the fact that less than 1% of all venture capital, less than 2% of all venture capital inside of this country goes to African Americans, less than 0.06% go to African American women. And when you're looking at the fact that even in the world of philanthropy, where people think philanthropy's got to be better, hardly. That even if you take a situation like Robinhood, where 80% of the population that we serve, the people who are living in poverty, around the cusp of poverty, are people of color, but only about 10% of all philanthropic dollars go to organizations led by people of color. We still have a situation in this country right now where we only have 18 Black-owned banks in this country that represent about $18 billion of capital when you're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar banking system. So we have got to, in addition to being able to teach how people can be entrepreneurs better, in addition to being able to teach what it means to not just ask a question about how much do those sneakers cost, but how much do you think that they cost to make versus how much are they being sold for? Then what's the margin? And then how much does it cost to actually create the material, and have people thinking about entrepreneurship in new ways? It is also about how are we putting together the infrastructure to be able to encourage entrepreneurship? Because we have, particularly in communities of color and particularly in low-income communities, you have an entrepreneurial spirit that we see and that shows itself in so many different ways. We also then have to be very sincere and very intentional about how are we then supporting that entrepreneurial spirit with things like access to capital, with things like making sure that you're not, putting yourself or your family at a deep and a dire risk every time you say to yourself, I think I have an idea that could work. These are things that we want to be able to be intentional about as well if we really want to create those kind of pathways.
Great. I want to call out, and I've done this previously already. I believe we have Richard Rhodes on from ACC, and would love to bring him on to ask a question. So, Chancellor of Austin Community College, and an amazing institution who's part of our cohort. We'll love to bring him on to ask a question here. And so again, I'm absolutely cold calling, and I don't apologize for it, but I do it to everybody. So Chancellor Rose, I want to see if we have you. I believe I just saw you appear. Give us a shout if we have you. If not, what I will do is, if we don't have you, I'm actually going to go to one of our other fellow Marylanders, Dr. Felicia Williams from Prince George's Community College,
Yes.
and want to throw one of our last questions to you. And again, I'm in a home state privilege here.
Thank you. So I'm curious, Wes, what you have learned or what your foundation has learned about some of the policies that you find have really been an impediment to this advancement that are really parallel for advocacy through the higher education arena as well.
Quite a few. And first, let me just say I'm a very big fan of you and your leadership. So thank you for everything you're doing down in Prince George's and the state and beyond. Sincerely, it's meaningful and it matters. So there have been quite a few things, I think, on the policy that have been incredibly disruptive. One is and it really actually goes back to who and where are we actually holding people back very intentionally. So for example, I tell you, one policy that we think about that we have in place is restrictions on the usage of Pell. And restrictions on the usage of Pell, particularly when it comes to students who are returning citizens or students who are returning home from incarceration, where we know that 95% of people who are incarcerated are coming home. We know that 95% of people who are incarcerated will be reintegrating back into our society, and the level and the measures of restrictions that we have on them as they come back to the communities that they call home are just absolutely disastrous. And they're disingenuous if we're actually serious about this idea of second chances. And so in addition to basic things like, housing policies and telling people that they cannot live in public housing, even if your family is there. And by the way, if you choose to rejoin your family, even though all the data shows that the familiar reintegration actually has a significant impact on bringing down recidivism rates, that then your family will have to leave. Public housing will be in violation. This is something that the fact that we have not addressed this is so amazingly problematic. The fact that we have people, whether it's people being able to take advantage of Pell Grants in prison or even when they're returning back home, the fact that, yes, you can apply to college, and even if you check boxes, which is a whole nother conversation, but even if you get accepted into college, yes, you can attend. However, you don't qualify for Pell, nor do you qualify for many other forms of aid. And so these are the type of things that I think that there is a level of cynicism in the way that we have policy approaches that I think has to be addressed if we're going to be serious about this. I think we also have, so it's both about the policies that we have in place, and then it's also about the things that we're not doing and the things that we're not focusing on. One of the ones that we mentioned before was our lack of ability to do anything about how we're thinking about state and municipal supports during this time of economic crisis. I mean, we have seen economic shocks like we have never seen before. And particularly when you're looking at the speed and the severity of how this economic hit has actually impacted our communities. But the fact is that we still have yet to have any real focus on being able to have supports for our state revenues, our municipal revenues, and for our local colleges, particularly our community colleges, despite the fact that so many of our citizens, for so many of our citizens, this is their refuge. And so when you look at the fact that state revenues take a long time to recover from economic shocks of this magnitude, after the 2008 recession, state tax revenues overall didn't return to pre-recession levels for over 5 years. And even 10 years after the recession, remaining below pre-recession levels in 1 of every 5 states. And then, by the way, once that 10 years hit, COVID. So we have to be honest about the fact that it's both about the policies that we have in place that we then can have real measurable triggers to be able to create better senses of pathways, better senses of not just financial support, but operational support for our students and for our institutions of higher education, particularly our community colleges. But then it's also about the fact that there's a whole lot that we could be doing that we've just chosen not to. There's a whole lot of decisions that we could be making that could actually provide pathways for students that we've chosen to walk away from. And so it's I think it's with that level of focus and determination and data-driven honesty that I think that these are the type of conversations that we need to be able to put in place. And actually, particularly right now, because I think there is this conversation about the fact that, well, since we're having these economic contractions, this is a time to actually get tight. I actually would take the opposite approach. I actually think in the time of economic contraction, this is our time to get creative. This is our time to get aggressive. This is our time to take the fact that we still have states and local municipalities and frankly institutions with everything from a cheap dollar to very good tax rates and tax ratios. If we're not taking our AAA bond ratings out for a spin and our AA bond ratings out for a spin now, I'm not sure when we're supposed to. Particularly when we have our most vulnerable students and our most vulnerable families and institutions that can serve them that are being starved. This is something that I think gives us the opportunity to actually be a bit creative and to be a bit more thoughtful about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's particularly important based upon the funding model by state. And so for the states where you've described where the municipalities play a significant role in their funding model, this is a double whammy from the state side as well as the municipal side. So I think that's extremely important.
I got to tell you, Dr. Williams, and part of the reason I just have so much respect and admiration for what you've been able to do is you have not had a lot of support. If I'm just being, and listen, we are a 501c3. I do not take political positions, but I can tell you this: I believe in honesty, and I believe the honest answer is that for a place that has or had, and likes to lean on this idea of having the number one educational system, in the country, it's amazing how short-armed we've been during this time. It's amazing of how we have watched these institutions that have literally been helping to keep people's head above water during this time have to fight and scrape for basic resources, especially when you're talking about a place that is the wealthiest state in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. I just have a very difficult time hearing arguments about how we all just need to be more frugal, because when we're having conversations about frugality, it's just interesting that we're always talking about the same people and the same institutions.
I think this is a purposeful and a powerful place to end this conversation. And so whether it's you're hitting the hand clap function on Zoom or whether it's you're actually doing actual hand claps, I want to give a big round of applause to Wes Moore, my brother and my friend. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for your support for CUNY, which is going to make a difference. And honestly, I think this is, again, why we wanted to bring in folks like Wes to talk to this group, because like I've said, this is, yes, about credentials and credits and what counts for what, and how do we create the on-ramps to employers. Well, this is about a bigger body of work, and I said this to our group before we got on this convening today. There's that great quote from Dr. King about, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. A president that I used to work for used to say it doesn't bend by itself. It bends because people put their hand on it and they bend it towards justice, towards equity, towards prosperity. And this work is about that right now, and that's what's happening. And so every now and again, because this is going to get hard, and every now and again you have to pull your head up from your feet and look up at the stars, because that's what we're doing right now, particularly in the moment that Wes has described for us now and that Kathleen described for us at the beginning.
And I'm sorry, Chike, if I can just very, very quick, I apologize, but I also just wanted to very quickly just to say thank you to all of you for leading in this moment.
Yes.
This is a time when we've watched leadership, watched leadership tested, and we've watched leaders exposed. Because we've seen people who the lights have gotten very bright for them, and they have shrunken because the lights got bright. And we have seen people that that have stepped up for communities and stepped up for our communities in really powerful ways. And not only am I incredibly grateful for the partnership that you all have given, and I know I've colleagues like Christine, who's just amazing on this call as well, and partners from CUNY and beyond, but also truly for all of you for reminding people why this is important, because and I think right now also you'll hear this debate from people about why are we focusing on higher education? We just be funneling people into employment and funneling people into jobs and so on and so forth. And I'll hear people make the same arguments, right? They'll continue to say things like, well, Wes, you don't understand where, the current employment focus is going to be. Or Wes, many people don't have college degrees and they're just fine. And they'll use the same names, right? They'll say, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have a college degree, and Bill Gates doesn't have a college degree, and Steve Jobs doesn't have a college degree. And my answer is always the same. It's like, listen, everything you're saying is right, but here's the reality. Had Facebook flopped, right? Had Apple remained a fruit, Steve Jobs would have been just fine. Mark Zuckerberg would have been good. But that's not who we're talking about. And that's not who we're fighting for. And so if we know and we know and we know the importance of your institutions and what you are providing to your communities and our communities, what you're providing to your families and our families, what you're providing to your students and our students, it is just crystal clear to me that our responsibility now is not to retreat, but our responsibility is to double down. Because it's exactly what our families need right now. It's exactly what got us to the points that we're in right now, is that we had those pathways available. I had those pathways available to me. And so I just want to just say from a very deep and a very personal place, thank you. Because I know it's hard, and I know right now we are receiving pressures from all over the place, to include budgetary. But the fact that you all continue to show what leadership looks like, and the fact that the light is not too hot for you, it's very meaningful. And so I know I speak on behalf of not just a very thankful organization, but a very thankful community for the work that y'all do. So thank you.
So I think you all have heard, we have 3 other keynote speakers. Each of them made specifically demanded to not go after Wes. They actually specifically said, don't do that to me. And you've seen why. Thank you so much. And we echo his thanks. You all are taking the time to do this initiative, and not just these 3 days, but these 2 years. And honestly, for all of you, this has been a life's worth of work to try and make a place. And to be honest, I'll say our biggest leaders aren't up on stages in front of podiums. They're in the seats that you're in, looking to make a big difference. And we're going to spend time tomorrow kind of down in the weeds. But again, it's important to figure out, to keep our eye on the horizon, which is, how do we do a scale what has never been done, which is to take people that we continually fail and create a pathway. How do we create a pathway to a better future, not just for them, but for their family? One day, hopefully, because of this work, someone's going to be sitting in a seat like Wes and saying, the thing that changed life for my mom or my dad was that they went to this program at CUNY, or went to this program at Pima, or went to this program at Seattle. And that's why I'm here. I haven't even met those people, but I know that my life is different because of what got done, hopefully starting here. And so, Wes, I just thank you for pulling our eyes there. And I really more thank even the people who are on this call.